Resuming debate, the honourable member for Kildonan St. Paul.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you. I'm very happy to be talking. Actually, I'll take that back. I'm not very happy to be talking about this today in the House of Commons, the circumvention of the democratic process and the very important discussion we're having at C-21. I have a lot to say about the many amendments that were being discussed at C-21, and I may not have the right to talk about those, at least in a very, very limited way, at committee if this time allocation motion passes today, Madam Speaker. And I do want to just put on the record as well to open this what we're really talking about. The Prime Minister's made his true agenda very, very clear to Canadians. Very recently, in the last 4 months, when we've been having this discussion of C-21 and the Liberal efforts to expand it to be the largest hunting rifle ban in Canadian history, when the Prime Minister was pressed about this after enormous backlash from the hunting, sport shooting, farming community and Indigenous community, he did admit that taking hunting rifles away is the goal when he said, quote, "Our focus now is on saying, yes, okay, yes, that we're going to have to take away from people who are using them to hunt," when asked about the hunting rifle ban. So he said it himself. He's let Canadians know what his true intentions are. So no matter what the Liberals talk about, no matter what slogans or quick words or terminology they want to use or make up or pull out of thin air, he's made it very clear that the Liberal government, in partnership with the NDP and the Bloc Québécois, are going after firearms used to hunt by Canadian hunters, farmers, and Indigenous Canadians. So there's a lot to talk about today. And again, just to underline, if this passes, the discussion at committee that we're having about C-21, which actually has been proceeding now that the Liberals have let us resume the process of C-21 discussion at committee, is proceeding quite well. We've done almost half the amendments, and there are many, many, many amendments. We've done almost half of them in just 2 meetings, which is, considering how contentious this is record time. Record time. And considering they reintroduced a so-called new definition, the previous version, which is almost the same, really put shockwaves through the firearms community in Canada. So you would imagine that our scrutiny as opposition parties is very high. So it's quite miraculous, actually, that we've managed to get through that and half of the amendments for C-21, which amount to inches of paperwork, those amendments that impact 2.3 million gun owners, their families, their communities, hundreds of millions of dollars of our economy, and tens of thousands of jobs, not to mention centuries of culture and heritage in Canada. It is actually surprising that the parties have worked so well together at committee, and we've gone over almost half of the amendments in only 2 meetings. Quite surprising. So why the need for this motion? Well, it's very interesting. Part of the work that we've been doing at committee is to, of course, heavily scrutinize C-21 and the very sneaky and underhanded amendments that the Liberals introduced at the 11th hour of committee back in, I believe it was November 2022. That's when everything blew up about C-21, and hunters and farmers and Indigenous Canadians saw the true feelings of this government to come after hundreds of their firearms. When that was going on, remember, C-21 is supposed to be the so-called handgun ban, which is not really that either. And then they expanded it to banning hunting rifles, long guns, many, 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 hundreds of long guns. And so, of course, Conservatives right off the bat said, well, that's not in the scope of the bill. We went to a vote at committee to rule it out of scope, to just kick this part out of C-21 for good. The NDP teamed up with the Liberals and voted down that out-of-scope vote. We could have stopped this right at the beginning if not for the NDP. Of course, they're working very closely with the Liberals on their true agenda to take away firearms from hunters, sport shooters, farmers, and Indigenous Canadians. That was right off the bat. And then I think the NDP was having some remorse. Obviously, in their rural and northern communities, there was significant backlash. I know for a fact that the NDP member from Northern Ontario got a lot of backlash. And so the NDP sort of moved to almost want to rule this out of scope, which we appreciated, the hunters appreciated. And now they've completely backtracked, despite almost the exact same definition coming in, and actually much worse, which I'll talk about in a minute. And so, again, Conservatives, in our diligence at committee last week, we moved to rule this out of scope again. Because, again, the bill is not about long guns. It's not about banning hunting rifles. And yet the Liberals, working with the NDP, are trying very hard to make that within the scope of the bill. They voted down that vote yet again. So it's very convenient that today's time allocation motion It's very long and talks about a lot of things, but in essence, what it does, which is really important to remember, is it expands the scope of the bill. So they're retroactively expanding the scope of C-21 so that we can't rule it out of scope. Because, of course, a last-ditch effort we could do, one last parliamentary procedure we could have tried, was going right to the Speaker to rule this out of scope with C-21, and considering he represents a rural riding with tons of hunters, sport shooters, farmers, I would imagine he would have considered it, especially considering that we're right and it certainly is outside the scope. So I find it very convenient that that's part of the objective of today's motion. Oh, it's in the scope, which eliminates all options for us to rule out of scope. No longer do we have any parliamentary procedure left to rule this out of scope. Very important for people to understand that. This is a nuclear option. This is what happens when, say, committees go awry and there's hours of filibusters and nothing is moving, but that's not what was happening at committee last week. Again, we accomplished going through half of the amendments in a highly contentious bill in only 2 meetings. 2 meetings. Pretty impressive by every measure that I've seen in my time as parliamentarian. No reason for this at all. In fact, the NDP member on the committee has spoken more than almost anybody in the last 2 meetings. So it doesn't really make sense why they're trying to forcibly limit debate in the way that they're doing it. If this passes at committee, we will only have 5 minutes to ask any questions about each clause, which, if you've watched committee, which I know a lot of people interested in this have, we have to ask the officials, we've got to ask for clarification. Again, this impacts 2.3 million gun owners, their families, hundreds of millions of dollars of the economy, tens of thousands of jobs, centuries of culture and heritage in Canada. So the idea that we would limit debate so severely is very concerning to us, especially since we've been acting in good faith and have got through half the amendments in 2 meetings. I can't stress that enough. So I was very surprised to see this over the weekend. I have to be honest, Madam Speaker, it was a real slap in the face to the work that we've been doing at committee. If we wanted to drag it out, we could still be talking about that definition. There are so many ambiguities in that so-called new definition. We could easily be talking about that still. Yet we had our questions. We recognize that there's other things to talk about at committee. It is a public safety committee, and we're in a public safety crisis in this country because of repeat violent offenders that the Liberals keep letting out of jail. I'll talk about that later. So many things we should be talking about at the Public Safety and National Security Committee. So we're moving along, and this is what we get. A real lesson to me, Madam Speaker, about working together at committee. I've learned my lesson today, Madam Speaker, about giving any benefit of the doubt, acting in good faith at all. Obviously, it's upsetting, because we are working hard at committee, and we are doing our due diligence, and this is what we get. Forcing the elimination of proper debate and scrutiny on C-21 amendments that impact millions of people. But anyway, I think I've harped on that enough. Maybe I'll come back to it later. So let's talk about this new definition, right? It's really not new. It's just almost like lipstick on a pig, for lack of a better word. So I'll outline the old definition. I'll read it to you now, Madam Speaker. It said, a firearm that is a rifle or shotgun that is capable of discharging centerfire ammunition in a semi-automatic manner and that is designed to accept a detachable cartridge magazine with a capacity greater than 5 cartridges of the type for which the firearm was originally designed. That was the original definition. We called G4, or it was G4, so folks have heard G4. That was G4, along with a number of other things from the May 2020 OIC, which people are very familiar with. And then it was also table dropped, or it was not table dropped, it was provided in very short order in a very sneaky, underhanded way with G46, which folks will remember was hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages long and looked to ban an additional almost 500 long guns. That's where the infamous and very, very popular for hunting, particularly the Indigenous community, SKS was found. And again, this list was massive. It was about, I don't know, I can't show you because I can't use props, but it was about 3 inches thick. So they dropped that in a very sneaky and underhanded way along with this definition. So again, months went by, there was a massive uproar, hundreds of thousands of phone calls and letters and social media posts from the firearm community across Canada. And the Liberals, for once, I've never seen this before, relented and withdrew G46 and G4. Wow. Wow, that was actually quite shocking. I've never seen them back down on anything before. That was round 1, as we found out. Round 2, here we are, yet again, almost no change. And actually, I would argue it's worse now, and I'll tell you why. So this is the new definition. I just read the old one. It says a firearm that is not a handgun and that discharges centerfire ammunition, mentioned before, in a semi-automatic manner, mentioned before, and was originally designed with a detachable magazine with a capacity of 6 cartridges or more. And so there was a bit of weasel word change there, but very, very subtle, Madam Speaker. And so the reason they mention that a firearm that is not a handgun, it's interesting, more weaselly maneuvering here. The French translation for what they originally had was fusil de chasse, which means hunting rifle. That was the direct French translation of what they were trying to ban last year, late last year. But of course, there's tens of thousands of hunters, sport shooters, and farmers in rural Quebec. I think the Bloc forgets this, but there are. And they were in an uproar, obviously. So now the government has worked this out so that, oh, at least it doesn't say hunting rifle in French. But that is the translation of what they were trying to ban just in November. Let's just be clear about that. They've just switched around the words a little bit, Madam Speaker. Very interesting. And so what's very problematic about this, Madam Speaker, is that the government has, not bragged, I shouldn't say that, but they have, we'll say boasted, we'll say, or talked at length about how they're not bringing forward the big list. Don't worry, the big lists, we're not going to ban those in legislation. That was what the public could scrutinize. There was over almost 500 additional rifles and shotguns in there, many very commonly used hunting rifles. And so there was a lot of them in there, and the public could at least see the list, and they did, and they were shocked at the amount of hunting rifles that were being banned. Now the government says, don't worry, we're not bringing forward the list again, just the definition. But what they're doing in a very sneaky, underhanded way seems to be a theme when it comes to banning hunting rifles for this government. Let's do it, backdoor. They are bringing forward a firearms advisory committee. And they keep referring to the Firearms Advisory Committee. When asked about the SKS, for example, that doesn't technically fall under this definition, but was on the original list, they've as much as told us that the Firearms Advisory Committee will look to ban that. The minister has said that. The parliamentary secretary has referred to that immediately when asked about the SKS. Oh, the Firearms Advisory Committee will be looking at that. So what is this, the Firearms Advisory Committee? Well, they're saying it's a nonpartisan group of experts they're putting together. We've heard that before. They've had similar advisory committees for firearms, and they've had some of the biggest anti-gun groups in the country on that so-called advisory committee that they've had before in a previous iteration. So I don't trust for 1 minute that there's going to be advocates for lawful firearm ownership for hunters, sport shooters, farmers, and Indigenous Canadians in this regard, from this perspective, on that committee. Not for 1 minute, Madam Speaker, do I trust that that's going to be the case. And they keep referring to that committee whenever we ask about the SKS. So to me, it's very clear, and the language that was used just today in the House, if I could find it here, was very telling. She said, we will take a look at that. She was referring to the SKS and the 482 firearms to decide which ones to move forward with. When she was asked about the SKS, that's what she was referring to the Firearms Committee. To decide which ones to move forward with banning was what she was talking about. So, but it's, again, very sneaky because there's no list we can scrutinize. It's just some unelected body, the Firearms Advisory Committee of so-called experts, which we know will be partisan anti-gun groups from the country. They will be coming up with lists to ban. So this is actually worse than what we had before, Madam Speaker, because now we can't see the list. It's just going to be sort of not even announced likely. It's just going to be new lists added to the OIC or some other version of it that people will find out somehow down the road that they can no longer own. Very arbitrary list indeed. And I'll remind folks that in May 2020, after the worst mass shooting in Canadian history, it was the worst mass killing actually in Canadian history, and in the hours and days following that, when people hadn't even had the chance to bury their loved ones or properly mourn the people that had been lost by that vile, sick killer, this government was scheming to bring forward the May 2020 OIC. And they did. And there was 1,500 long guns that were banned in the cloak of darkness during the middle of the pandemic, just as it hit Canada. Remember, it was in May. Pandemic had just hit about a month and a half prior. They banned that, and they subsequently added 400 more long guns over the last couple of years to that. And then in November, another almost 500 added on again. So they're not going to stop. And you ask any Liberal, oh, is this going to be the last firearm ban you're going to bring forward? I would be shocked if any of them said yes. Because again, this firearm committee is going to be bringing forward tons of more firearms to ban. Again, they keep referring to it when we ask about the SKS, a ubiquitous hunting gun in this country, Madam Speaker. So I don't trust them at all. And again, we've been acting in good faith, and here we are with this time allocation motion to limit democratic debate, Madam Speaker.
Order. The honourable member for Vancouver-Granville.
The honourable member noted that she was dealing with the criteria. She's ignored one important criteria, and that seeks to taint the conversation.
I would just say that this is a point of debate and not a point of order. It's a point of debate and not a point of order. The honourable member for Kildonan St. Paul.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
I just want to remind the honourable member he will have an opportunity to ask questions and comments. So if depending on how many people rise to be recognized, the honourable member for Kildonan St. Paul.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'll just remind the Liberal member, if he's looking to throw me off, then he's severely underestimating me like many a man before him. I have a lot to say, Madam Speaker, and I will be here for quite some time, so hopefully he's hydrated and fed, because he's going to be waiting a long time. All right, so more on the announcement last week that is impacted by C-21, Madam Speaker. So the minister at the same time announced this Firearms Advisory Committee, the so-called new definition, old definition, but sneakier. He also announced that there's going to be something about a permanent alteration to magazines, which we have already, but the way that he worded it would signify to me that there's going to be a change of what that means. And when we tried to ask about the committee, we wouldn't get any answers because it wasn't technically within C-21, apparently, but he announced it at the same time. He was talking about C-21. The Liberals wouldn't answer our questions. The officials wouldn't answer our questions. But what was taken from that in the firearms community, that the permanent alteration of magazines would go a step further than what's done now, and it would impact many a firearm that really is Grandpa Joe's hunting rifle. For example, the Lee Enfield. Very popular firearm. It was the British firearm up until about the 1950s, and it was well made. It's been passed down through generations. It's completely wood stock. It's exactly what you'd think and picture when you think about Grandpa Joe going out to hunt deer. Exactly what you think. However, you cannot permanently alter the magazine capabilities of that firearm without destroying it. There is no way. So is the minister saying now that he's going to destroy the Lee Enfield? He won't answer. I urge people to write in and ask the minister about that because he won't answer our questions about it. Neither will the Liberals on Public Safety Committee. I will also note that firearms, and these are really old school hunting rifles, tubular magazine firearms, that's where you put the bullet right in the tube, so to speak. There is no magazine like you'd think, like the image that the Liberals bring forward. It's an old school 1800s level technology of firearm. You put them in the tube. They have a capacity, like example, the Winchester 1873, I think it's called, is a tubular magazine firearm that holds 7 to 14 cartridges or bullets. And you cannot alter that in any way. You would destroy the firearm. These are heirloom firearms. I'm pretty sure my grandfather had one in the closet for when coyotes would try to get into the chicken coop. That's how old school these firearms are, and there are hundreds of versions of these that are within rural Canada and for collectors and certainly for hunters and Indigenous Canadians. If the SKS is popular in Indigenous communities, so is the Lee Enfield, let me tell you, Madam Speaker, in Indigenous communities. So why won't they be clear of what they're talking about when they talked about these permanent alterations to magazines? Why are they being so cagey about that? Do they just not know? Is it ignorance, or are they hiding something? I don't know. I've given them the benefit of the doubt before, and yet here we are. They're forcing an end to the democratic discussion and scrutiny that is needed on this bill in committee today, so I really don't trust anything that they're about to say on that, if they say anything at all, because they've refused to answer my questions and our questions on public safety about the Lee Enfield and tubular magazine long guns. So this is going on. We've heard so much about this, and the Liberals are really attacking us, particularly me, I suppose, because I've been the lead on the firearms. They talk about Conservatives more in their announcements, that they talk about the crime that is wreaking havoc in our communities that they're not doing a lot about. And Madam Speaker, I do want to say that I know that this debate is very heated, very personal to people on all sides. I recognize that. I have always done my best to lead this discussion from our perspective, from a professional standpoint, an authentic standpoint. And what really shocked me, Madam Speaker, was last week. Was it last week or was it the week before? Might have been the week before, when the minister was announcing his so-called phase 1 of the buyback, which I'll get to. He said that, in essence, that Conservatives were at fault, bared some of the responsibility for the abuse that Liberals are getting from what they say are gun owners. I have no idea. I haven't seen that. What's really interesting, Madam Speaker, is they talk about it as if we haven't received any abuse about people who don't agree with our position. And I can tell you that I have certainly received very threatening abuse for my position and for our position that we've taken. I am the lead on this file. I have taken many hits, many threats, concerns for my safety in this debate. So I was very offended when I heard them trying to blame Conservatives, and I'm the lead in this regard, so me, when I have not been saved or kept from any of that abuse myself. I am undeterred. I will continue on. I will not be bullied to be into silence on this. But just to be clear, the rhetoric from the Liberals is trumping up a lot of hate towards myself and others on this side of the House as well. And I don't like talking about it. We don't want copycats. We don't want any heroes from these evil, sadistic people. But when I heard something like that, I thought, I have to say something. I've kept quiet, but I will not stand idly by while the Minister of Public Safety blames me for the abuse he's gotten for his underhanded policies, when I too have suffered abuse because of his rhetoric. So I just wanted to put that on the record, Madam Speaker. I hope to speak to the Minister personally about that. So we're talking a lot about firearms, and of course exclusively C-21 only impacts, really, particularly the so-called handgun freeze or ban, which really isn't any of that, really impacts only people who follow the law, which are the trained, tested, and vetted Canadian citizens who are approved by the RCMP to own firearms. That's really all the people that are impacted by all of these measures since the May 2020 OIC and Bill C-71 before. It only impacts regular, everyday Canadians who are legally allowed to own firearms, heavily vetted Canadians who are legally allowed to own firearms. And yet they continue to bring forward measure after measure after measure to attack this group of people, Madam Speaker. Meanwhile, criminals are running rampant on our streets. I've talked at length about the crime issues. Canadians know full well what's been going on public transit and on the streets of Toronto, and everywhere you go in Canada there seems to be horrific headlines of innocent people being attacked by complete deranged strangers. We are facing very serious issues, and yet the Liberal budget 2023 really failed to address those violent crime issues. In fact, they didn't mention violent crime, was not mentioned once, 0 times in that budget. You want to know what else wasn't mentioned in that budget, Madam Speaker? Bail reform. Bail reform was not mentioned once in the budget, has not been mentioned in the priorities of that budget from the Minister of Public Safety, despite the fact that all premiers of every province and territory in Canada have written 2 letters now to the Prime Minister demanding bail reform, because what is happening in their provinces and territories in terms of crime and repeat violent offenders continuing to get bail and back on our streets hurting Canadians. When have you ever heard every premier in the country agree on a letter? It's very rare. Maybe when they're asking for health care funding. But aside from that, it's a very rare occurrence. And yes, now it's 2 letters sent to the Minister of Public Safety. Actually, also sent to the Prime Minister, I should say. Those letters were sent to the Prime Minister, pardon me. Also, municipal police forces. I just spoke at the Big Ten Police Conference, which is every major police association, municipal police forces across the country. I just flew to Calgary last week to speak to them. They're demanding bail reform. Every big city mayor in Ontario is demanding bail reform, Madam Speaker. So while everyone seems to agree on bail reform, there's been no meaningful action or change taken by the Minister of Public Safety on bail reform. And I'll remind those watching that of violent crime in this country, which is up 32% from 2015 to 2021, which when we get the 2022 stats, it's going to be deeply concerning. I'm going to guess that they're going to be way up just based on the headlines. So 32% between 2015 and 2021, which equates to 124,000 more violent crime incidents per year, which is an insane amount. of additional crime that police are having to deal with despite police numbers really suffering, which I'll talk about more in a minute. So we're seeing that crime wave steadily increasing year by year under this Prime Minister and Public Safety's watch. That's all happening. And actually on that, bail reform is a huge issue, because if you look at Vancouver, of these, there was 6,000 crime incidents, interactions with police for crime. 40 people responsible for 6,000 interactions with police. Those 40 people are sure keeping police busy in Vancouver, Madam Speaker. And these are violent, repeat offenders causing havoc on transit, when you walk down the street with your family, when you're trying to enjoy the parks. 40 people causing 6,000 interactions with police in 1 year. And yet, crickets about bail reform. Oh, we're meeting and talking about it. That's all we hear. It's been months. It's been months. In fact, the Victoria Police recently put out a news release. I think this is consistent on their news releases when it's relevant. Recently put out a news release where some vile rapist who committed 10 sexual assaults with a weapon, 10 sexual assaults with a weapon, this man. Why was he released? Well, the police wanted to make sure the public knew why it wasn't their fault he was released. At the bottom of the news release says, why was this person released? Bill C-75, Madam Speaker. That is a Liberal bill from a few years ago, which made, in essence, the default for bail for violent repeat offenders. They just got bail on default. And so now, you know, chicken's coming home to roost. We're seeing a massive crime surge. This is one of the reasons police are underlining this and making this heard to MPs over and over and over again. And yet that's all going on. We're hearing from the Toronto police statistics that they put out. Of the 44 murders, I think it was last year or 2021, of the 44 murders, 26 of them or 24, about over half. Of the 44 murders, over half of them, the murderers were out on bail at the time.
Unbelievable.
Out on bail.
Shame.
Over 44 murders, over half of them could have been prevented if the Liberals hadn't brought in such a weak bail regime. And they're getting up at the mic and talking about how this so-called new definition, old definition, no list, sneaky list given to the Firearms Advisory Council. They're talking about how that's going to solve crime, or one of the things that's going to solve crime.
Shame.
It's not going to do anything for the people in Toronto that are getting out on bail and murdering people, which Toronto police will remind us that about 9 out of 10 firearms that are used in crime, and it's mostly handguns in Toronto, are smuggled in from the U.S. You could outlaw, and I'm sure they're working on it, every single handgun legally owned in this country, and it will get worse in cities. It will continue to go up, the statistics, because they're not legally owning them, these criminals, Madam Speaker. Most of them are prohibited from ever going near a firearm. Most of them should be in jail. Repeat violent offenders, because they smuggle them in quite easily through the Prime Minister's very porous border. That is he just allowed all these drugs and guns to come into the country, and human trafficking and all kinds of other things he's allowed under his watch, just flowing into Toronto and other big cities, and Montreal as well, and Winnipeg. I've seen the firearms myself. Winnipeg police have shown me smuggled ones. And 3D printed guns. People are just taking those 3D printers and printing plastic handguns, going for $7,000 a pop on the streets of Winnipeg. Bill C-21 will do really not a lot for that. There is an amendment we worked together to maybe give police a teeny little extra tool, which I support it. But going after lawful firearms owners isn't going to do anything for the problems in Toronto. Those 20-odd people who were murdered by those on bail reform who smuggled guns in or printed them, nothing in C-21 is really going to stop them. And the Liberals talk about, oh, well, we're increasing mandatory or maximum sentencing on gun smugglers. That is technically true, but in reality is baloney, Madam Speaker. We did an information request to government. One of my colleagues did great work there, asking about how many people have received the maximum sentence right now for gun smuggling. Do you know how many since this Prime Minister has ruled the country? In about 8 years that he's been Prime Minister, do you know how many people have got the maximum 10-year sentence for gun smuggling activities? 0.
Wow.
0 people have gotten the mandatory maximum.
Brutal.
So to increase it to 14 is really not going to do a whole heck of a lot, Madam Speaker. What they should have done is maybe bring in mandatory minimums for gun smuggling. Now that would have taken criminals off the streets. Exactly. So that would have actually done something, maybe. Maybe. And we were looking at maybe doing that with an amendment, but we were told it was out of scope, so we couldn't bring forward mandatory maximums. But maybe that's something a member for Carleton as Prime Minister of the country will look at, because that'll make a real, actual difference on cracking down on gun smuggling, Madam Speaker. And I'll remind the House that the Liberals, how they're going after lawful firearm owners to such a degree and with so much taxpayer dollars and so much effort from the Minister of Public Safety going after lawful firearms owners. At the same time, in the fall, the Minister of Justice brought forward or passed a bill that he apparently celebrated quite excitedly when it was passed to remove mandatory maximum or minimum sentences, for serious gun crimes and violent crimes. You want to know what the list is? Robbery with a gun. You can rob a store with a gun and no longer a guarantee that you're going to jail. That's the Liberal Prime Minister's vision of what we should do about crime. You can rob someone at gunpoint. No longer a mandatory minimum for you. Extortion with a firearm. Weapons trafficking. Importing or exporting, knowing it is unauthorized. Discharging a firearm with intent. So things like drive-by shootings. No longer mandatory prison time for you, Madam Speaker.
Shameful.
Using a firearm in commission of an offense. Breaking the law with a gun. No longer mandatory prison time. All right. Possession of a firearm, knowing its possession is unauthorized. So illegally possessing a firearm. No longer mandatory prison time for you. So all those criminals in Toronto, it was a good day for them, Madam Speaker, when Bill C-5 passed. Possession of a prohibited or restricted firearm with ammunition. So you can have a prohibited gun with a whole bunch of ammunition, no longer mandatory prison time for you. Again, gangs are celebrating this Liberal Prime Minister every time he's elected. Possession of a weapon obtained by commission of an offense, so stealing one, in essence, no longer mandatory prison time. Possession for purpose of weapons trafficking, excluding firearms and ammunition, and discharging a firearm recklessly. Discharging a firearm recklessly, no longer mandatory prison time. You know, people die in cities because there's gangsters discharging firearms recklessly all the time, ones that they've smuggled in and 3D printed. No longer mandatory prison time for them, Madam Speaker. In fact, in that same bill, Bill C-5, the Liberals brought forward sort of an improved option for sexual assault, or people commit sexual assault. Now they can ensure, the law ensures, that people commit sexual assault, rape, don't have to go to prison. They can actually serve house arrest from the comforts of their homes. Rapists can serve their sentence playing video games with their feet up in their own homes. Madam Speaker, it's unreal. I shouldn't be kind of laughing about it, but it is so outrageous and ridiculous. It's hard for me as a woman to wrap my head around a so-called feminist government saying that rapists can serve house arrest for their sentence. And this happened. This just happened in Quebec, Madam Speaker. A vile rapist violently raped a woman and got 0 days in prison and only 20 months in house arrest.
Shameful.
So this is all in the scope of what the Liberals view as their crime priorities. And they're getting up at the mic every other day announcing new gun control measures to go after folks who are lawfully allowed to own firearms and saying that that's going to make a difference. You know what will make a difference? Repealing Bill C-5 and making sure violent criminals and rapists go to jail. That'll make a difference on public safety. So, and it's not just firearms. In fact, a lot of the crime we're seeing is knives. Where's the conversation about knives? We just had, I believe it was the third largest mass killing in Canadian history. Barely heard a peep about that, certainly not from the Liberals. We tried to study it at committee and they wouldn't let us. Just in the fall, the third largest mass killing in Canadian history. A man who got out on parole despite...
One moment. We have a point of order. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Safety.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm sure the honourable member doesn't mean to mislead this House, but there was absolutely no stoppage of anything on the stabbing at James.
I would say that this is debate.
So I hope she's not trying to mislead the House.
Yes, I would say that this is debate, and I would ask the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to consider rising to be recognized for a question during the next. When it's time for questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Kildonan St. Paul.
Respectfully to that member, Madam Speaker, I remember those committee meetings very, very well. I tried very much, so did my Conservative colleagues on committee, to bring forward an urgent study of what happened, how the parole system failed the 11 people that were butchered by knife by that man who was out on parole, the 17 more that ended up in prison, the third largest mass killing in Canadian history, you think that that would be an urgent priority to review what happened in our parole system? And we were given excuses, oh, let the people do their work. Sure, they could do their work, but we need to know what happened now, or we need to know how we can prevent it now. At least an intro study. I was very clear that we needed to study that right away and perhaps have a follow-up once we heard more. That was met on deaf ears. The third largest mass killing in Canadian history was not a priority for public safety. They were too busy planning to bring forward the most underhanded amendments that it constituted the largest hunting rifle ban in Canadian history. Too busy to study the third largest mass killing in Canadian history. I could talk all day about that, Madam Speaker, because I feel quite strongly about it. Why is it that a First Nations community that had 11 people butchered by a man on parole was not prioritized? We barely talked about it. The Public Safety Committee has not looked into that. I think that is a failure that we could be talking about if the government wasn't so occupied with coming after lawful firearms owners, Madam Speaker. That man, I believe, had 59 prior violent crime convictions. Why was he allowed out on parole? I don't know. But 11 people are dead and 17 more were stabbed with a knife by that vile man. A lot of knife attacks are happening, and bear mace attacks actually as well. I have a friend who just told me that his kids got on, I believe he's in the Calgary area, got on public transit. His kids were just going to a party, college-aged kids. Just nice young people, bear maced. All of the whole group bear maced. And the police had told them that that had been the 8th time that had been happening recently. 8th time some punks had bear maced innocent people on public transit. Okay, well, they lived. So maybe the Liberals don't think it's a priority to talk about, I don't know. But the stabbings, where young people are being stabbed to death on public transit and older folks. In fact, there was a violent knife attack on a Surrey SkyTrain, which is their public transit, that left a young man in hospital. And the suspect, the man who attempted to murder that man with a knife, was let out on bail about 9 days later, Madam Speaker. And you're telling me that bail reform isn't in the budget. 9 days later, someone who had stabbed someone, attempted to murder him, out on the streets. This is Liberal Canada, Madam Speaker. But it's important to go after lawful gun owners, apparently. And then this follows the death of a 17-year-old also in BC who was stabbed to death on a bus. Died. He was murdered by knife by a murderer on a bus just recently. And this followed a 16-year-old boy who'd been stabbed and killed in Toronto Public Transit Station. These are young people that are being murdered. And there's countless other examples. There was a woman who was ice-picked last year. There was a woman who was set on fire in Toronto near a public transit stop, I believe. There are elderly people who are being pushed to their deaths. Like, it is common now for people to feel uncomfortable riding public transit. And we're not talking about bail reform. There's no action coming forward of bail reform, how to clean up our streets. And yet we're talking every other day about going after lawful. I mean, I can go on and on about how frustrating this is. And to speak nothing of what police have experienced in the last year. So bail reform, we've been talking about it, Conservatives, for quite some time. But the country really started talking about it quite strongly just as a result of something that happened over Christmas. There was a man, and again, nothing that the Liberals have announced will do anything to stop what happened to Greg Priscilla. Young OPP officer, about 27 years old, young, keen on the job. December 27th, just 2 days after Christmas, there was I think it was a truck in a ditch. He approached the truck in the ditch, and the driver shot and killed him. That driver, lifetime repeat violent offender, lifetime weapons prohibition order, out on bail at the time. Shot and killed that police officer. He's no longer with us because of our bail system, Madam Speaker. So that sparked, obviously, a national outrage, and that's where the first letter from the premiers went to the Prime Minister demanding bail reform, obviously. And then there's been a subsequent one, and police have been very vocal. In fact, the Toronto police, and these police guys and gals are like stoic people, getting emotional, speaking up at the mic at their meetings about the need for bail reform. And Greg Priscilla was one of 10 police officers killed in the last year, 8 of them on the job. That is insane numbers for police murders. Unbelievable. And police, pardon me, have had a pretty rough go of it over the last number of years. Their morale is very low, and yet these are dedicated men and women who kiss their families goodbye in the morning and are never 100% sure if they're going to see them again. Especially after a year like this. 10 of them, 8 of them on the job. most of them, or many of them involved, are murdered by repeat violent offenders who shouldn't be out on our streets. Unbelievable that we're not talking about bail reform, that they're not making announcements about bail reform every day or parole reform. These guys, and it's mostly guys that are getting out over and over again, shouldn't be on the streets. I think almost everyone agrees with it except extreme leftists who want to go soft on crime, who seem to have taken over the Liberal Party crime agenda. It's unbelievable, Madam Speaker. And so if we're looking at even in BC, NDP province, to its full credit, NDP province writing to the Liberal cabinet about all their violent repeat offenders. These are unbelievable statistics. I had to check them on the article that was published about a week or two ago to make sure they were right, but it seemed by the reporting that these are them, and I'll read them to you. There were 1,325 violent offenders on trial, but prosecutors, so government lawyers, asked only for detention 516 times. So over 1,300 violent criminals, government lawyers only asked for about 500 of them to not get bail. And of those 500 that they actually asked for, judges only granted bail denial 222 times. So of over 1,300 violent repeat offenders in BC, only 221 of them actually were denied bail. That is astounding. That is less than 20% of violent criminals not getting bail. Why isn't the number higher? It should be asked every single time someone has a violent record, shouldn't it? Why are they only asking for it less than 50%? Why are government lawyers asking only half of the time, actually less than half of the time? And why are judges only saying less than 20%, yeah, this violent repeat offender with a long rap sheet shouldn't be on a bail? I don't know. I'm not a judge, not a lawyer. I don't have the expertise to talk about that, but the Liberal government and the Justice Minister in charge of our criminal code should be talking about why that is happening and how we can fix it, how our justice system can be better supported with criminal code changes and other measures to ensure that our court systems are equipped to ensure that the most violent people do not get out on bail, so that the 17-year-old boy in BC who was stabbed to death, so that he's not being stabbed to death. So the 16-year-old boy in Toronto, so that he's still alive. So Greg Priscilla, still alive. So that in parole, the parole board, which I will add on that, there's been a 36% decrease in the amount of staff on the parole board, an 11% funding cut for some reason. And maybe that's why we get mistakes like what happened in the fall on James Cree First Nation, where that man I mentioned already killed and murdered 11 people, butchered them to death. I mean, it's so frustrating as even just not as a conservative, just as a Canadian, as a woman who cares about the safety of my family, walking down the streets. Women already have sort of a fifth sense about this a bit. You know, we're concerned walking at nighttime, concerned getting into an elevator alone with a bunch of men. This is innate in us. And to see that women no longer want to ride public transit in many cases, especially in Toronto, our biggest city, and they're not really talking a lot about that when we have a clear demand of bail reform. But C-21, that's a priority, going after lawful firearms owners. And so I'll remind folks as well that when they first brought forward these amendments, in that very sneaky way in November, and then they withdrew them on November 3rd, they said, well, we're going to do consultations. So we did a couple consultation meetings at committee, and we brought forward a lot of people to talk about the impact that those amendments would have. Liberals saying they're not going after hunting rifles. Well, we brought forward a lot of hunters, experts in that regard, and they have a very different opinion than the Liberals. The ones who actually use these to hunt have a very different opinion than the Liberals who want to ban them. Interesting, Madam Speaker. But the Minister of Public Safety also went on a nationwide tour to consult himself, and he received quite the backlash in many of the meetings that he went to. I wonder how many Conservative ridings. Exactly. I'd love to know that, actually. I would imagine it's not very many. But anyway, he went to Yukon, and in the local paper there, the Yukon News, on January 25th, in response to his tour to talk to hunters, he was looking to take their firearms away, he said, or it was said in the media, quote, none of those who spoke with Mendocino and pardon me, I'm not allowed to say their names, I take that back, sorry, Madam Speaker. None of those who spoke to the Minister of Public Safety or the Liberal member for Yukon, pardon me, were supportive of the proposed legislation. They each gave their reasons. Among them were longtime firearm collectors concerned about a loss of value in their collections, relatively new sports shooters encountering confusing rules, it's a recurring theme we're hearing actually from the firearms community, and the police that have to enforce these rules. And hunters, trappers, and resource industry workers worried that the firearms they rely on to protect themselves from animals in the wilderness will be banned. And in that same article, it was quite, the quotes were quite, I will say emotional would be the polite word, of the local people that were so-called consulted by the Minister of Public Safety, deeply unhappy with what the Liberals are trying to do. And so there was a lot of that going on his tour. He heard loud and clear, and yet he brought forward a very similar definition. And rather than being transparent with the very long list of hundreds of firearms they're looking to ban, they're going to pass it on to a firearms advisory committee. So despite all these consultations at committee, all these consultations with the Minister of Public Safety, and all the things he's heard firsthand from the real law-abiding people that all these things impact, they're trudging forward, plowing through, Madam Speaker. Liberals are determined to gradually, in fact, actually quite quickly, eliminate a lot of hunting rifles from Canada. And so at committee, we actually had a lot of Indigenous leaders come and speak to the impact all of this would have on them. And again, C-21 has a number of red flag provisions and other things that I will say, when they were originally brought forward, I thought, oh, red flags, like this is supposed to help vulnerable women and Indigenous women, and this could be good. I actually stood in the House and said, why don't we split red flags from the bill so we can maybe usher those along more quickly, take the politics out of it so we can protect vulnerable people. I stood in the House, the Minister of Public Safety shouted down that motion that I brought forward to do that. Again, another good faith effort from Conservatives to take some of the politics out of this contentious issue, shouted down by the Minister of Public Safety. I will never forget that. Anyway, so Indigenous leaders, women chiefs, and others came to committee, and they were very alarmed by some of these red flag laws, in fact. They said a number of things. They talked about how the red flag laws, in essence, they felt, and again, I'm paraphrasing, but they felt that there could be people who have negative views of Indigenous people could more easily call in and make up false stories about Indigenous people to take their firearms away. This is a real thing we heard from multiple Indigenous leaders, that this will not be good for our community and those who don't like us, in essence, to paraphrase their sentiments. That's what came across. I'm like, oh, okay, that's not so good. This is supposed to protect Indigenous people, particularly women. It doesn't seem like they want this at all. In fact, they don't want it very badly. And then we also heard from law experts, women in the law experts. I think that was the name of the organization. It was a Liberal witness. There was also a anti-violence against women Quebec group. All three of these groups who were brought forward, I think the thought process from Liberals would be to support these red flag laws, said that they're terrible. They don't want them. They actually further burden women who are being abused by their partners. The exact opposite of what I thought the red flag laws were going to do. So obviously I'm not going to support them. We're not going to support them. And I don't believe some of the other opposition parties did either. So again, we can work together on a few things. That's evident. But again, this is a measure that was trying to be brought forward by Bill C-21 that wasn't listening to the people that they were trying to help, to the issue that they were trying to solve. Another very clear example that they were not listening to vulnerable women and Indigenous people about something that they said was going to help them. Just symptomatic of how the government approaches firearms, Madam Speaker. There were also, I'll talk about, it was pretty interesting. We had one of the most notable Canadian hunters, really incredible guy from an incredible family. His daughter, this is Jim Shockey I'm talking about, his daughter is quite a hero for young women hunters across the country. I'll have to say, one of my sisters follows her on Instagram, has for years. Anyway, sidebar. He said, everybody understands hunters are not a threat to public safety or the national security of this country. However, we feel vilified and marginalized. Recently, we felt attacked. We're not the enemy. We love our country. The taking away of life is obviously a terrible and fundamentally wrong thing, and the taking away of a way of life is also wrong. Pretty powerful quote, I thought, coming from someone who knows hunting really probably better than almost anyone in the country, aside from the Indigenous Canadians who've been hunting on this land for thousands of years. So when Liberals say this isn't a hunting rifle ban, well, ask hunters, Madam Speaker. They saw the SKS on the list. They saw other firearms on the list that they commonly use for hunting. So who should the public believe? People who actually hunt and use these for a living and pass them down to their kids, or liberals who, as we've heard from the Prime Minister, says that some hunting guns are going to have to be banned. And in my opinion, that's just the beginning, obviously. Again, ask a liberal, is this going to be the last hunting ban, or rifle ban, or shotgun ban, or firearm ban? I'm going to guess they're going to say no, Madam Speaker, or they're going to change the subject real quick. Then who else do we have? Well, we had Martin Bourget. He was, him and his wife, very lovely actually. They're Quebec French, they have a Quebec French hunting show, because hunting in Quebec is huge, massive, massive industry in Quebec. And they said legitimate gun owners in Canada are deeply puzzled about the very legitimacy of the process set out in Bill C-21 and the enforcement of these measures. They are asking for nothing less than a study of the bill's true impact on the safety of Canadians and on traditional hunting, harvesting, and sport shooting. Of course, we never really got an in-depth study about all of those things. We had a couple consultation meetings, and now they're really trying to limit debate of the impact of many of these amendments. So unfortunately, Mr. Bourget and his lovely wife and all the, I think herself, the wife, represents 20,000 female French hunters. Pretty amazing, actually, that exists. I really hope I get a chance to go hunting with them someday. Anyway, they're speaking for their large group of hunters. Not a big fan of this. I feel that the consultations haven't been met, and the true depth of respect that is needed for our hunting community, our farmers, Indigenous Canadians, not being met at committee and certainly not being met by the Liberals. Actually, I will tell you, there is something on consultation. The Liberals did a few years ago, they did a consultation on firearms. They spent over $200,000. We got this from an information request. They spent over $200,000 on this request. Of the 133 respondents, about 87% of the respondents, when asked about should further measures be taken for against handguns, in essence was the question, 87% said no. Of the 133,000 respondents, when asked the same question about so-called assault-style firearms, again, Liberals made-up term, not a firearm term, but that's the term they use. Anyway, 133,000 respondents, $200,000 of this consultation, and I think it was about between 70 and 80% said no more action needed. I think that's pretty shocking. The actual consultation they spent significant taxpayer dollars on, and 133,000 people responded. Very few of them think that any of these measures should be undertaken, so I assume they kind of just chucked that in the garbage because they really haven't talked about it at all, and the evidence is right there, and yet they don't want to look at it or acknowledge that that's, in fact, what Canadians believe. They talk about some random poll once, and that's it, but the 133,000 people that were asked, not a lot of support for what they're doing. Anyway, very inconvenient facts for the Liberals that we found out through an information request. So, who else did we ask? We talked to someone from the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters. This is a massive hunting and angling. One of the oldest associations, I think, in the country. Very notable, very reputable, very moderate. It's a hunting and angling association. I grew up going to my local Game and Fish Association. These are some of the lifeblood of the hunting community. And certainly being from Ontario, I believe that this Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters is the largest in the country. I think they represent about 100,000 members, active members, let alone the other impacts that they've had, all the family members and small communities that they support. And they said firearms are not the disease, particularly in a nation like Canada with robust gun laws. Gun violence is often symptomatic of a much bigger societal issue. Very, very poignant point. Yes, I would agree with that. Taking firearms away from law-abiding Canadians will not reduce the upstream issues that fuel criminal activity and the demand for illicit firearms. Therefore, model-based firearm prohibitions will continue to fail as they won't be able to have a detectable impact on reducing gun violence or enhancing public safety. Again, this person isn't a legal, or actually they might be, I don't know their real profession, but I don't believe they're a legal expert, and yet very eloquently put in a very obvious statement that they've taken that seems very foreign when you're looking at the Liberal priorities on firearms and the relentless assault on law-abiding Canadians. Marc Renaud, president of the Fédération Québécoise des Chasseurs et Pêcheurs. They said in French, but I'll say it in English, we strongly believe in the power of education and prevention for promoting firearm safety. Our members want to feel safe, too, and they hope new laws intended to improve public safety focus on the right targets. Hunters and sport shooters who comply with the training requirements and get the right licenses are the wrong target. Again, this was in response to the November 2022 G4 and G46, the definition, the long list. They brought forward a very similar definition and the list will just be passed over, as was said today in the House by the Liberal Parliamentary Secretary, to the Firearms Advisory Committee. So again, we're here again. These are the comments from hunters, from large hunting advocacy groups. And they're still saying this isn't a hunting rifle ban. Linda Keiko, Olympian, women's pistol shooting. So many people may not know, and again, if you follow Olympics, you'll know this, and Olympians, we're very proud as Canadians about our Olympians. Well, we have Olympic sport shooters as well, and have had for a very, very long time. I think over a century we've had Olympic sport shooters, obviously. I mean, if you look at hunting just like anything else, if you have hunters, if you have farmers who use them as tools, if you have people in the military, if you have police, you're obviously going to have folks that use firearms, and who's the best shot? Who's the most accurate target? That's obviously something that comes from the firearm community, very obviously. It's actually a sense of real pride if you're a good marksman, someone who knows nothing about hunting or sport shooting wouldn't understand that. I get it. But if you are from a hunting community, every person knows that when someone gets a big buck, you sit around the table and the hunter relives his epic or her epic story about the hunt, and they tell you, oh, it was 400 yards and it was windy, and they recount this great story of their great hunt. It's part of the culture. Indigenous Canadians the same for thousands of years. This is important. So if you're a good marksman or markswoman, it's something that you'd almost brag about. This is very normal and natural in the hunting and sport shooting community. Of course, sport shooting also comes in part from that. So it is incredible that Canada has some of the best marksmen in the world. And Linda Keiko and her family are some of the best marksmen in the country. In particular, she's in the women pistol shooting. And the Liberal efforts to freeze or ban or whatever they're saying of C21 on handguns, which really won't do any of that. All it does, really, we've heard from our Olympic sport shooters and our national sport shooters from IPSC and the like, which is a national sport shooting association that competes internationally. We've heard that what this will really do is impact our sport shooting community. It makes it very difficult for them to get new parts for the tools they use when they compete. Makes it very difficult for them to bring their firearms in and out of the country for competition. Makes it very difficult for Canada to host any sort of sport shooting competition. It makes it very challenging. The World Fire and Police Games are coming up in Winnipeg. Actually, it's hosting the World Fire and Police Games. Pretty incredible. And it is a nightmare to try to get firearms in for the important parts of that of the sport shooting part of that competition. Again, real sense of pride for Winnipeg and Canada that we are hosting World Fire and Police Games. Very excited this summer. That's a sidebar. But Linda Keiko, our proud Olympian, who all Canadians should be very proud of, I am certainly, and I know the Conservatives are, she said, I take great pride in representing my country on the world stage, as do all athletes. I'm sad that due to the handgun ban, the Order in Council, Bill C-71, and this proposed legislation, C-21, I will not be able to represent Canada on the world stage. Athletes who come after me won't even have an opportunity to compete, as they will have no access to competition firearms. So the Liberals with C-21, out of the mouths of the sport shooters themselves, they are wiping out sport shooting in Canada. Certainly this will be the last generation that ever sport shoots, certainly with pistols for sure. And when asked about that, when challenged about that at committee, the Liberals looked down their nose at our sport shooters, and in essence, again, people can go look back at the video footage, but in essence we're saying, well, Canada doesn't want that anymore. We don't want that, those dirty Olympian sport shooters. I'm paraphrasing, obviously. This is my tone being put on the Liberals. So, but people can go look at the video. It is in essence just looking down their nose, judging sport shooters, saying, you're not welcome anymore in Canada. We don't want you. Get out. That's the sense that I walked away with when I watched that interaction between Liberals and our Olympian. I couldn't believe it. Everyone should be proud of our Olympians, especially our best marksman and a woman. That's awesome, you know? Like, geez. So we will fight very, very hard to ensure that we can continue to compete internationally with IPSC and Olympic sport shooting. But again, once this passes, and they did it already through regulation, we will see the death of sport shooting in Canada, particularly with pistols first, and then likely the rest if they get to proceed with their true agenda here. So it's just very frustrating in that regard, Madam Speaker, that we have real people who actually use these as tools coming forward to committee saying you're banning our hunting rifles, you're banning our ability to compete in sport shooting on the world stage and represent Canada with pride. And they're saying, no, we're not. No, we're not. That's not true. So who do you believe? The people who are impacted by that, or the Liberals who don't want people to own firearms, which is what I think is really going on here. So what about the data? We could talk a lot about the facts of this, because we see in committee the Liberals bring forward folks of various stripes, and we're all allowed to bring forward our own witnesses. That's part of the democratic process. But this is the party that consistently says we follow the science. We believe in data. We follow the science over and over and over again, except when the science does not suit their agenda, Madam Speaker. It's very clear. Some of the best researchers in the world are from Canada when it comes to firearms. Dr. Kaylin Langman is an award-winning researcher, highly recognized in the medical and scientific research community for his work. He has scrutinized every possible data point in Canada, looking at how the impacts of subsequent gun control have come in and what that has done or not done on homicide, whether it's mass homicide, domestic homicide. He's looked at it all for decades, looked at it. He's looked at Australia. He's also commented on the UK as well. And not only has he done his own research, but he's reviewed the research of others because of his very high, the ability that he has to heavily scrutinize data, and again, widely recognized in the scientific community for his high level of integrity and scrutiny on this. I have not seen one piece of evidence even close to the integrity of Dr. Kaylin Langman when it comes to the firearm impact of gun control on homicide. There's nothing that holds a candle to it. They brought nothing forward. And I've heard actually in the court cases that are ongoing on this right now, they haven't brought forward any evidence, the government really either, to make their case for this. But that's another discussion I will likely get to at some point as well, Madam Speaker. So Dr. Kaylin Langman, after all of his research, he said the evidence so far demonstrates that the proposed handgun and semi-automatic rifle bans would have no associated reduction in homicide rates or mass homicide rates. Methods that have been shown to be more effective in reducing firearm homicides involve targeting the demand side of the firearm surveillance and criminal activity. So again, it seems very obvious. This is what police have been telling us, but he's actually seen that in the data. In fact, what he's found, and some other researchers of high repute have also found, is that the only real impacts you can have in terms of responsible gun ownership are basic things that we've had for almost 30 years. So we could talk about background checks, licensing, and safe storage. Those are the only proven things to have an impact on homicide and public safety when it comes to firearms. The only things, and those are things that are very much supported by the Conservative Party of Canada and that we've had for a number of years. That is responsible gun ownership, Madam Speaker, and we're behind that 100%. Only licensed, trained, and vetted by police people should ever have ownership over firearms. That is what we believe. That is very clear. That's what the evidence says is important to protect public safety. And yet they're ignoring the scientific evidence by highly reputable researchers and medical doctors, and they're cherry-picking the information that suits their narrative. That has been widely really shredded by Dr. Kaylin Langman in his high degree of integrity and research ability. We also have Dr. Terry Bryan, Chief Firearms Officer of Alberta Chief Firearms Office. I have actually never met a person who's as much of a firearms expert as she is. It's incredible. You ask her about any firearm and this woman knows. It's unbelievable, great to see. And she said, even after the withdrawal of G4 and G46, Bill C-21 continues to undermine confidence in our firearms control system while contributing nothing to reducing the violent misuse of firearms. Bill C-21 is built on fundamentally flawed premise. Prohibiting specific types of firearms is not an effective way of improving public safety. It will waste billions of taxpayer dollars that could have been used on more effective approaches such as the enforcement of firearms prohibition orders, reinforcing the border, or combating the drug trade and gang activity. Again, it seems self-evident, but to hear from an expert who's charged with this at the provincial level, it's refreshing. We had her expertise at committee. And again, all of this was said, and yet there really is no change in what was brought forward. And we asked a number of questions just to say, again, actually, on the definition, Madam Speaker. The Liberals brought forward something else that I think I should have mentioned at the beginning, but it is unsettling because we're not really clear of what the implications will really be. It seems good, kind of, but then maybe it's really not. And again, based on their track record of lack of transparency on this, I'm deeply concerned. So there's, in essence, sort of a forward-looking clause that they've brought forward for that definition. It's kind of a grandfathering clause in a way. Anyone who owns these firearms that they're looking to ban now apparently gets to keep them Who would have thought? We get to keep them, they're saying, for now. Of course, we'll see what the Firearms Advisory Committee says in a couple months, Madam Speaker. But they're saying anything that falls under this new definition that they've brought forward, which is really the old definition, anything that falls under the new one, you actually get to keep those and you get to keep buying and selling them. It's just brand new models that are manufactured, can't buy those. So any new versions of these firearms you don't get to buy. So, okay, that sounds okay, I guess. It just kind of limits almost exact same firearms that'll come out that are new. We can't buy those, but we can buy these. That doesn't really follow. It further doesn't follow. They've been getting up in the House and at press conferences for months now, actually for years, and saying insane things like these are weapons of war designed for killing people. They've been taking that position. They've been very clear. These are terrible things that no one should own. And yet now they've brought forward a new definition that allows everybody to keep them? That doesn't make sense. So we spent about an hour and a half asking clarifying questions about this, and I'm not reassured that what we're seeing is really the case. And if it is, what I can tell you is I feel quite confident that they're going to just shoot this over. They're going to say, oh, yeah, you can keep them, but we're going to send it over to the advisory committee and they'll ban it for us. That's what I think is really going to happen here, Madam Speaker. People will let their guard down. The firearms committee will let their guard down with this new definition, lets people keep firearms, but they're not going to get to keep them, Madam Speaker, because I believe under the Firearms Advisory Committee, which they've in essence alluded to when asked about the SKS, they're going to be the ones to do the dirty work, so to speak. They're going to be the ones, as was said today, to look at that very long list they were looking to ban that was hundreds of pages long and had hundreds of hunting rifles in it. They're going to be looking at that list and looking to ban those firearms. We heard as much today. So people should not be reassured for one moment by this new definition. It's kind of leading people down the garden path, so to speak, letting people let their guard down. But we know what's going on here, Madam Speaker, and Conservatives, along with law-abiding citizens in this country, private property owners who are trained, tested, and vetted by police, will continue to stand up for those people who have been repeatedly kicked by this Liberal government and treated terribly, like they're criminals, since that seems to be the focus, Madam Speaker. And just to conclude with my remaining 2 minutes, I believe, Madam Speaker, about 2 minutes, I do have to say this just to conclude for now. I know I'm going to take a pause and I'll restart at some point, but just to conclude, for this hour and 10 minutes that I've been speaking, the minister seems to have really, really cranked down on his remarks that Conservatives who we're standing with. He's been vicious in talking about who we're standing with, who, and I'm being the lead, so he's talking about me and the leader of the opposition, who I'm standing with when I'm talking about law-abiding citizens and fighting for firearms owners. He makes outlandish, unfounded claims about who I'm standing with when I'm in this House talking about this. I find it deeply offensive, and here's why, just to conclude, Madam Speaker. Do you want to know who I'm standing with, Madam Speaker? I went to a Game and Fish Association in rural Manitoba just the other day, and I spoke to them about, it's actually from my hometown, Beausejour, Manitoba, and I spoke to them about the work that I'm doing here in the House to fight for their way of life. And a big, burly, country boy came up to me at the end, Mr. Speaker. He came up to me at the end, and I was leaving. He was rushing to get to me. And he's like, please let me talk to you for a moment. And this big guy, and he's like, I just want to thank you for fighting for firearms owners, Mr. Speaker, he said to me. He looked me in the eye, and I could see that he was visibly getting emotional. He's like, thank you for fighting for us. Thank you for standing up for us. Thank you for always fighting against the Liberals and standing up for our way of life, Mr. Speaker. And he had to start walking away because he was getting emotional. This big country boy, I couldn't believe it. And I have actually been getting that a lot. So that's who I'm fighting for, Mr. Speaker. Those good Canadians, and I will fight for them every single day without stop, relentlessly, Mr. Speaker. So thank you very much, and we'll pick this up again next time. Thank you.
Well done.